Well, welcome. If people could take their seats, we're ready to get the show on the road. Very proud to welcome you to Michigan in Transition, Restructuring of Governance Through Privatization and Corporatization. You should know that this is being brought to you primarily through the Journal of Law and Society, which is a student-run journal, and the tremendous amount of creativity and intellectual energy and just hard logistical work has been done by them. And I'll point out Chelsea is in the front row, and to thank her as the editor-in-chief, and you'll hear from John Zervos, who is the symposium editor later. All right, so let's get the show on the road. What's exciting here is that we are building a partnership between the Journal of Law and Society and the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights. My name's Peter Hammer. I'm a professor of law here at the law school, but I have the privilege of directing the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights, and I would view one of the most significant accomplishments that we've done this year is to establish a meaningful partnership with the Journal, where we're rebranding the Journal, and this is a look at the new colors, the new scheme. We are focusing on issues that matter in Detroit from a civil rights perspective, and we're proud to be in Detroit and focusing on issues that matter to Detroit. So as you see very significantly, the cityscape on the back of the new journal, Detroit, Michigan being proudly displayed down in the bottom of the front cover, and the announcement of the new partnership with the Journal and the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights. So in many respects, while this may be under the waterline from your background in history, this is a huge accomplishment, and I think this is going to mark a very productive and exciting future between the work of the center and the work of the Journal. Today is Wayne State Law School at its best. Where we raise an important set of public issues. We convene stakeholders and experts on these issues. And as you know from the programs that you've been handed and hopefully the materials that drew you here, an important, interesting discussion on emergency managers in the first panel, an important discussion in the afternoon panel about privatization in water in the Detroit water system, and privatization in the healthcare with the Vanguard purchase of the Detroit Medical Center a few years ago. I'm also happy to announce that Dr. Robert Frank from the medical school will be added to our panel this afternoon to be thinking about the effects of the Vanguard purchase on the underserved communities within Detroit and Southeast Michigan. You get to be subjected to what my students get subjected to all the time, right? I was asked to try to help frame these issues. And I'm an economist as well as a lawyer. And I think about these things a lot. I've thought about them a lot in healthcare, which was the early part of my career. I've thought about them in the international public health and international economic development setting. And for the last 3 or 4 years, I've had the privilege of thinking about these issues with a very strong focus upon Detroit and Southeast Michigan. I'm going to talk about 4 principles, right? And they're not all going to be aligned in the same direction. And indeed, there's going to be some degree of tension between these sets of principles. But I think these are 4 very important principles to have in mind as we're thinking about public governance, about privatization, about corporatization. One is a notion of institutional agnosticism, and I'll explain a little bit what that means later, but a willingness to be flexible in our thinking about forms and the fact that different forms can accomplish similar functions. The second is to remind ourselves about constitutive values, right? Process can matter. How we define our institutions also defines ourselves, and over time, how we define ourselves should define how we think about institutions. The third principle is thinking about notions of complexity and the need for public policy to better accommodate complexities and systems thinking. And that has to be part of our discussion. And the final thought is to try to make the frame match the problem, right? And when you're trying to make the frame match the problem, you need to privilege your understanding of the problem first. And once you understand the nature of the problem, then you should be thinking about what regulatory framework or what kind of public policy framework you want to be thinking. So often we think the other way around, right? I can say it. If everybody has a hammer, you think everything's a nail. And that's not the right way to be approaching public policy discussions. So let's briefly walk through each one of those principles and see what they say. And I would encourage you, I used to have overhead, to show how old I'm getting now. I imagine sort of overheads you would lay over each other, right? And as you lay one over the other, you start to see how they interact, but you also see some of the tensions that created between these principles. This is not a unified theory. My background is in institutional economics, right? Not in sort of neoclassical economics. One of the most important teachings in institutional economics is the need to separate form and function, and to come to the realization that many different forms can serve the same function, right? And indeed, that can be quite a liberating notion or quite a liberating thought. You can trace a number of this thinking back to Ronald Coase in a 1934 article he wrote on the nature of the firm. Right? Now the irony is, if you just talk about neoclassical economics, there is no theory of the firm, right? And there is no theory of government, right? Which is why economists are not very helpful to tell you how to run a government or how to organize a firm. But those things mattered to Coase, right? And he adopted a theory where he saw that the same function can be carried out inside of a firm, right, through sort of hierarchical command and control. It can be carried out through a series of contracting, or it can be done on the spot market. Right? And think about General Motors and the make or buy decisions that you might hear about in the news or be taught in business school, and that all of those are different forms that can do the same function. Right? And then Coase starts to layer over notions of transaction costs and agency theory and other things that start to explain empirically why some things are organized in one form at one time and another form in a different, as well as the notion that the form will change if there's underlying changes in the background structures and forces. Now, there's an important public analog to that. Think about healthcare. I could have a country that organizes its healthcare completely through state-run apparatus, right? And internationally, we observe some of those examples. Domestically, we observe that, right? Does anybody know the strongest vestige of socialized medicine in America? It's the VA, right? A completely government-owned and government-controlled healthcare company. Alternatively, I could imagine structuring complicated sets of regulation to provide health care. I can also imagine a thought experiment where I completely privatize health care and do it in a private setting. This gets even more complicated if I'm willing to draw a triangle that doesn't go just state and market, but starts to robustly analyze and recognize that there's civil society as part of this equation, right? And so I can imagine there being triangular sets of relationships and therefore different organizational forms that could be hybrids between the state, right, between markets and private enterprises, and between quasi-public spaces or members of civil society, right? As I try to get my students to get in the mindset, this can be liberating, right? And the notion is this should break you out of ideology, right? That there is, in some respects, no real private, right? And there is, in some respects, no real public. In theory, and theory is not what happens in practice, in theory, these should be governed by empirical analyses. You should do a rigorous comparative institutional analysis of all the different imperfect forms, because there is no perfect form, public or private, and you should try to make policy, at least from my idealized world, where empirical concerns about what functions best would guide the relevant policy considerations. Right? When you're now thinking about comparative institutional analysis, I also teach my students it's sort of a triad, right, of important core concerns. Any functional, workable institution has to have systems of accountability, has to have systems of transparency, and has to have systems that promote legitimacy. Right? You can always go to any institution and assess it, right, in terms of how accountable is it, how transparent is it, how legitimate is it. Right? And those might be useful metrics as you're hearing the discussions further on today. So that's institutional agnosticism. All right. The second layover is the recognition that not all values are instrumental. Certain values define ourselves. Right? I think in the society that we live in, the right to vote is critically important. Right? And if we live in a world that has a right to vote and has public accountability through democratic processes, we have to protect notions of civic engagement. We have to respect the role of participation. We have to actually and vitalize, right, consciously promote civic engagement and deliberative democracy. I would also suggest that there are other key rights that we can start thinking from a civil rights perspective. I would like us to think much more about a right to education, a right to health. Perhaps in the afternoon discussion we can think about a right to water, right? And what it means to be imagining these from a rights-based perspective. Once I put this overlay on the previous discussion, one realization is I start to shrink the scope of acceptable public-private partnerships or forms that I would be willing to encourage or promote. right? And so there's got to be this interesting dialogue between what are my underlying constitutive values, right? And how should my underlying constitutive values then influence the scope and range of forms that I'm willing to accept to perform various sets of public processes, right? And more often than not, what is the source of legitimacy in public space? The source of legitimacy in public space, if I'm thinking about accountability, transparency, and legitimacy, often comes from the civic engagement, right? And often the absence of legitimacy is associated with not having meaningful forms of participation. The third point, right, is trying to accommodate complexities in systems thinking. A lot of public policy doesn't do it or doesn't do it well. And a lot of traditional public policy and economics tends to be fairly reductionistic, right? That is not going to help us address complex problems. We need to build in better appreciation of interconnectivity of issues, reciprocal forms of causation, the reality and existence of various forms of feedback mechanisms, some positive and some negative, and that has to influence the way that we approach public policy questions. Right? That said, we have a good example of that. Think about how radically environmental law and environmental regulation was transformed by the growing appreciation of an ecosystem. Right? And if I accept the problem to define the frame, and I understand the environmental problem as a complex ecosystem, then that has to radically change the way I'm going to approach environmental policy. Right? What I would suggest to you is that an equally sophisticated understanding of structural racism, right, is essential, just as the ecosystem is for environmental law, to thinking about every single issue that we're talking about today in general, and more particularly to think about how these issues are going to affect Detroit and Southeast Michigan. Right? You cannot think about Detroit and Southeast Michigan without thinking about the structures that perpetuate both opportunity and oppression. And some of the best work that's been done in this area has been done by John Powell, in my opinion, and some of his fellow workers down at the Kirwan Institute. Right? That's a complex system. That requires systems. Right? If you ignore the reality of that, you are not defining the problem correctly, and you're not letting your understanding of the problem then influence how we're going to think about what kind of templates and regulatory systems are appropriate to deal with that. Right? So the third point, we've got to layer in and have abilities to be thinking about things as complex systems and systems thinking. The fourth thing is matching the frame and the problem. Right? And again, I can see some of my students here nodding their heads. They've heard this before. Right? The sort of truism I try to teach is that the regulatory unit, right, must map onto the regulatory problem. And almost all of the problems that we have in terms of poor governance, unintended consequences, can often be traced by the fact that the unit that we're trying to solve the problem does not adequately or properly match on to an authentic understanding of what the problem is. Right? As I say, you can't understand and have policy for water, right, without understanding a watershed. Right? If you do that, right, you're going to sort of be forcing it. Water's going to flow where water's going to flow anyway, right? And many law or regulation you do is not going to matter. And I've already talked about the environmental policy and the ecosystem need to be matched. In this setting, geopolitical boundaries are typically, often meaningless, right? And often are actually end up being part of the problem and not part of the solution. From the perspective of thinking about the problem, I've already alluded to the need to understand structural racism. Thinking about these problems in Southeast Michigan require a sophisticated understanding of the region. Right? The region is the unit, right? Not necessarily the metropolitan boundaries, and we live in an ill region. Right? Our region is the most fractured, if you just talk about the number of different political entities and subunits, and we're also the most racially divided region in the country, or certainly one of them. And the intuition goes, and it's something I say often, you can't have economic integration without meaningful racial integration. Right? And we can't think about the future economy of Southeast Michigan without thinking about the role of race, and that means we've got to start breaking down barriers. Right? But if we're adopting now policies that don't reflect that, again, we're not letting the problem define the frame. So what might this mean for some of the issues that we will be discussing today? One implication is that the frame of simply thinking I balance the budget does not map onto the problem of financial distress in Michigan. right? Just imagining trying to get short-term revenues matched with short-term expenditures is not the right frame, right? Does not map onto the nature of the problem. The financial problems in Detroit are highly structural in nature, and they're deeply embedded, as I've suggested, in systemic issues of race and regionalism. Right? Any effort to solve those that doesn't take advantage of or counter those realities is not going to be effective. Right? We have to create greater space within our public discourse to respect complexity. Right? And anybody that gives you a simple answer is trying to fool you if you have a complicated problem. Right? That doesn't mean we throw our hands up and says we can't do anything. Right? When you have a complex adaptive system, what you have to realize is you're not in for quick fixes. You manage those problems. Right? And indeed, if you're thinking about managing a problem, frequently it gets reduced to a dashboard with simple indicators that you monitor over time and have the capacity to frequently adjust. Right? You need a change in the mindset, but it's a mindset that's willing to at least anticipate and welcome some notion of complexity. I was doing research on a paper that I'm writing on the fate of the Detroit public schools and ran across this quote from then Mayor Frank Murphy in the 1930s. And when I read it, it really echoed into our current discussions about emergency managers. Right? This is not the first time we've had structural economic problems. And Frank Murphy said to sacrifice everything to balance the budget is fanaticism. Right? And I think, again, we have to think about what's the proper frame to deal with the problems that we have. These are exciting times at Wayne State. Right? I've already said that the mission of the Journal of Law and Society and that of the Key Center are being joined. It is our true desire to facilitate better understandings of these problems, to highlight often neglected roles of race and history that matter in these types of important analyses, and to address the concerns facing Detroit in a way that is respectful to the civil rights dimensions of that problem. And I'd be remiss not to say some good words about Judge Damon J. Keith. Right? If you think about Judge Keith's life, this is what he's done his whole life. Right? He's been a man of the city, a person who's brought people together over Thanksgiving dinners, difficult conversations over tables, and somebody who deeply cares about the city. We want to carry on that legacy. We want to create a national reputation by meaningfully addressing the problems of Detroit, just as the judge has. And this symposium is an important step to that process. And this symposium is a partnership that will continue year after year. There's been another important innovation with the Journal and Center relationship. We're now going to be publishing 2 themed issues, right? And you get your special preview. Right? The topic of our first themed issue, in addition to this symposium, is on governance, right? And a governance issue focusing on Southeast Michigan. Not all of them, but some of the articles will include an article by my colleague Jocelyn Benson looking at how serpentine districts became law, Michigan redistricting in 2011. John Philo of the Sugar Law Center has a very good article about emergency managers and about the fundamental nature of the right to vote and the tension between the emergency managers and the right to vote. David Rusk, who's again one of my heroes, has a wonderful article looking at Grand Rapids and Charlotte, and he tells the tale of 2 cities, but has an important discussion about the role in our local government laws, right, which really act like property rights, that prevent rational regional planning. Right? And if we don't come to terms with that, we don't have an understanding of the physics that underlie the regionalism disputes that we have, and they get layered over then with issues of race. Gary Benjamin, a wonderful civil rights lawyer here in Detroit, has an article on SEMCOG, and he calls SEMCOG business as usual, a failed model. And it nicely maps onto the work that David Rusk does and shows how a failure in regionalism is reflected in our efforts to do regional planning and how our past efforts at regional planning have not been very successful. Right? My article takes a look at the fate of the Detroit public school systems from a perspective of governance, finance, and competition. And that was eye-opening for me. Right? As I said, I have done most of my work previously in domestic and international health and development. Trying to understand the problems of the Detroit school system really again shows where the template, if too narrowly framed, does not map onto the problem. Everybody knows that we have a financial manager for the Detroit public school system, and everybody knows that the Detroit public school system has been quote unquote irresponsible for creating financial distress. How many people here realize that the nature of the imbalance is the failure over the past 8 years to cut costs faster than revenues fall? Right? Typically, that's not our nature of blaming somebody for financial irresponsibility. Then you have to ask yourselves, well, why have revenues been falling? Right? It's been falling because of the way that the state compensates school districts. Right? And you have a formula for school finance that if you have a world of changing demography and declining population bases, is going to guarantee financial distress. Right? You can't cut those costs faster than those revenues fall, and yet the failure to do so was a justification to take over the Detroit public school systems with an emergency manager. Right? And then what do? We blame the victim. Right? And then we use that, and I argue in the article, as a pretext then for continuing state control over the school system. And the end result, in my mind, if I do the analysis correctly, the Detroit public school system will not exist in 5 years. It just can't, right, under the existing dynamics. And the failure to act, in my mind, is the same as the intention to discriminate. Right? The system may not have been designed in a discriminatory capacity, but if you have a complex system and you understand the dynamics of that complex system and you see the consequences of that dynamic and you do not act, right, in my mind you intend the consequences. Right? Even if constitutional law currently is structured is not well designed to recognize that fact. All right, now we get to talk about other political lines and other things that actually can change and are changing. This is coming from Jocelyn Benson's article that was talking about the serpentine districts. And I see our keynote speaker, Congressman Hanson Clark here. This oddly shaped 14th district, right, is what is being drawn and is what is going to be imposed upon Michigan in the upcoming election. And different people, like a Rorschach test, have tried to talk about what that shape looks like. Professor Benson talks about a leprechaun's shoe, right? And well, I guess if you torture yourself a little bit, you can see that. But it has an interesting irony. We let these lines change all the time. Right? And yet, as I said before, our inability to let the geopolitical lines in southeast Michigan move an inch, right, really lies at the heart of our regional failure.